You'll do
Certainly.
a screen share, I presume, with slides.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
You're a presenter now, Alberto.
Thank you.
So if you click on that screen icon at the bottom, it should bring your screen up.
Okay, there it is. Can you see it?
Yeah. But all we're seeing is the GoToMeeting screen. I don't think we're seeing your PowerPoint.
There should be, right?
Yay, there it is.
There we go.
You see the full screen? I think so. Okay. So this is what I'm going to review over the next 30 minutes or so. It's very general. One of the first things, this is a very general question that I have come across several times and through just general conversation. How novel this coronavirus is per se as a coronavirus that infects people. Yes, it is a new thing, and yet the whole group of coronaviruses is fairly vast, and they are divided in multiple groups. You see here gamma, beta, alpha, delta coronaviruses, and each of these may have some preferential host, and as you can see there are some such as the top ones, the gamma coronaviruses that infect avian species for the most part, and some others that have a much wider range of hosts, such as the beta coronaviruses. You see some mammal species in there, and some particularly the bats, which is one of the main questions in that kind of follows the general one that I have come across. And so, anyways, it is the coronaviruses have been around for millennia, millions of years probably, and they have a vast host, vast range of host species, and it is just which one they have adapted to the most. As far as the disease, one of the general things that we need to understand when we come across somewhat new disease is how the natural presentation of it could follow, and these will be depending on what kind of interventions can be adopted, and these are just the three general scenarios. What we have worldwide tried to do is to flatten the curve, as they say, which would be either somewhere between the green line and the blue lines, right? Depending on how aggressive and how well applied those interventions are adopted, and so, hey, again, if there is any questions, please let me know. But otherwise, I will skip quite a few details in order to stick to that initial time. This is what we have as of yesterday. We are possibly by today, I haven't checked the numbers, but we are likely to be right at 7 million coronavirus cases globally. And if you see here, the daily new cases starting in January. As the world has encountered new cases, we are not out of the woods really. If we drill down to individual countries and regions within each country, then the picture might be different. And yet, as the world is facing this pandemic, we are definitely not out of the woods, as the new cases are just still increasing. And as far as the daily number of deaths, it looks like there's been some improvement, perhaps more due to the evolution of treatments of patients with the disease. And so it seems again that there is some improvement there. The peak has passed about a month ago, maybe a little more, 6 weeks back or so, and so that is a good thing. When we look at the numbers, there are multiple websites where we can look at these statistics, and one of the main ones is to look at the total number of cases as in absolute terms, and yet sometimes this is a little conflictive because it is one of the causes for so much confusion, and in the sense that this is not always a good way to look at this type of information. We can sort these same numbers and get them to show by total number of deaths, for example, and then with that, as you can see, the ranking by country would change. We have in total number, absolute numbers, and we have
Alberto?
USA, Brazil, Russia. Yes,
Alberto, could I break in just a minute?
Sure.
I have a suggestion. I just made a screenshot of you. This is a very nice slide. There's a lot of information on it about these different countries. And I want to keep it, and I suggest maybe some of you others would too, if you're interested in this disease. And you can easily make a screenshot. I just discovered.
Right. Very, very easily.
I go Command Shift 4, and I can make, and I can outline it and click it, and I get a screenshot. If you know what I mean. Right.
I've
got it saved now.
Most of my slides have the reference, the online reference, and this is one of the most cited sites, the Worldometers, that has a section dedicated to COVID-19, and I'll be glad also to share the PowerPoint presentation with you all. Maybe I can just send it to Gladys, and Gladys can distribute to everybody, and that way you don't have to take screenshots one at a time. You can have it all at once. But hey,
maybe Molly can
that's
put
right.
it on the webpage also.
This website, right? So this website lists all countries and more. And you can sort all this information by each one of the headers of these columns. I'm just giving examples for what you can do. This is another example that I like to do quite a bit, because it gives me the list of countries in terms of ratios. This is the number of deaths per 1 million of the population for each of those countries, and that is a way to more effectively say compare statistics for different countries, when all these countries certainly have different population sizes, and so comparing, say, the the USA with about 320 million people, 330 million people, with Belgium with just barely shy of 12 million people, is not really apples to apples kind of comparison. And yet, when we do it in terms of ratios, then we can have a more fair, say, way of compare these two. So this we're gonna get now to look at what countries have done when it comes to what kind of interventions, what kind of approach they took with COVID-19. And I came across this short video that shows, by changing the colors, what kind of level of excuse me, restrictions each country has established, starting in January and ending in early June. And you can see how they started very lax in the beginning with light colors, and then the countries started to excuse me, impose some restrictions to the movement of people, transportation, particularly long travels, businesses, congregations of people, that kind of things, trying to stop or slow down the spread of this disease. And so I'm going just to play it for you all. It lasts just a few seconds. But you can see there how the map is getting darker and darker, and starting obviously in China, where it all started. And now going to May is when you start seeing some countries relaxing the level of restrictions that they have imposed. This graph on the left side attempts to show what kind of relationship exists between the stringency level of restrictions by country and the number of COVID cases. It's not very clear cut as a graph, and even though there is a dotted line there that attempts to depict that there is a direct relationship between the two, I think the fact that the dots are so spread out up and down that dotted line, it tells me that it is not necessarily a strong correlation between these two. And I think the other factors are one, for example, very important, such as the level of enforcement. Many countries, even though they established some stringent level of restrictions, the enforcement was not as good, and so people ended up doing pretty much whatever they wanted. And I think we are, or we could be, in a similar boat here in the United States, or at least in some states. Drilling down to more specific countries, these are some examples that I found graphs to show in a visual way what the effect of those restrictions have brought over the development of these epidemiological curve of the disease. So we have China on the top left of these slide, and then we have to contrast these, and Lolly particularly was very interested in looking at the case of Sweden, because Sweden has made the news throughout the whole pandemic, because they decided to pretty much not impose any restrictions. I understand they did a little bit of restrictions, but a very, very low level. They never closed restaurants, for example, and places of gathering. and so they pretty much decided, other than trying to keep the elderly particularly more safe by establishing some minor policies looking at this sector of the population, they other than that decided to just be free and do not restrict their population from anything that they wanted to do. So multiple pictures online about Sweden and their inhabitants having a good time in restaurants and going to the movies and that kind of just normal daily life. And yet we will see a little later what ended up happening. But up to early May, mid-May, which is when I pulled these graphs, everything was looking fairly good for that that approach that Sweden took. Unlike many others, again, China, a quick increase in cases, and then as they went really aggressive on their countermeasures, they really flattened the curve, and that's what you see there in a matter of just a few weeks. Countries like France reacted a little late. As you can see here, the darker color of their curve is when they really increased their stringency of measures. It just continued to go up. Italy over here, right below France, kind of similar picture, but an earlier time. And Italy and Spain were also quite famous because of the rapid increase in cases that also made reference to some of the concepts that are also mentioned frequently, which is the super spreaders or the that cause hotspots in a matter of just a few days. One of the effects that was almost immediately observed was that people just decreased their rate of movement, and this was a nice visual that I found for Britain, where you can see the level of activity as the restrictions were imposed in the UK, so that it came dramatically down as the disease went on in the UK. And also looking at the map before pandemic, and then sometime early May as well. May 5th is when this website was accessed, and the darker the color here on the map indicates higher level of activity. This was done through tracking mobile phones. This is also an interesting graph showing the daily deaths at their peak for multiple countries, and so you see some of these that have also imposed somewhat unique or very disciplined, I would say, approaches to combat this disease, like South Korea. As you see here, they flattened the curve pretty early on, after the onset of the disease in that country. One of the things that they did strongly, more than restricting the movement of people, more than that, it's not that they didn't do it, they did, but more than that, they immediately went on in very intense level of testing, as well as tracing and isolation of people who was infected or had some risky contact with infected people. And so that kind of measures are being claimed as some of the most effective, and it is in fact some of the things that a lot of experts are now advocating for. This is just another similar graph, but looking at new cases and also showing how that those curves by country are or have changed. One that I wanted to also highlight for you all is this one here, New Zealand. They went very early on after the onset of the disease in the country with very stringent measures by pretty much shutting down most of their airline movement, and they only allowed trade to continue, and even then with some level of restrictions. But other than that, the movement of people was highly restricted. They were almost at the very beginning of the whole thing, allowing people just to come back, New Zealand nationals to come back to the country. But other than that, even the tourist industry, which is highly dependent on international tourists, they just shut down almost entirely. But one of the also most interesting things to me was that it was not just the government establishing these type of policies, but also because people embraced them. They took it very seriously, and they were allowed to be out on the street for only 1 hour a day for exercise purposes or for going to the stores to get some supplies, food, for the most part. And so the country really embraced this great deal of discipline in my perspective, and that's something that allowed them that within 4 to 6 weeks from their shutdown, they definitely flattened the curve, and I believe last week or the week before last, they came down to only single digits as far as new cases. So they have done pretty well. And one of the other things that's also quite interesting is regarding the African countries, and it seems like the African countries are not being hit as bad as some others. Some initial reports that looked at the spread of the disease across regions, they tried to see whether there was any effect by environment, temperatures. And one of the things that most of the continent of Africa has is their weather. They tend to have very high temperatures. And these researchers did find a little bit of correlation in there, although it hasn't been as strong as the correlation for some other respiratory disease viruses, like the flu, for example, where it almost goes away as soon as the temperatures start to warm up. One of the factors that some epidemiologists point out as a potential factor contributing to this effect is that many of these countries have a greater rate of young population, and it makes sense if you compare these with some of the countries that were hit more severely, like Italy or Spain, where their population tends to be a little older than those in African countries. One of the questions that I have come across with some regularity, particularly from people with political inclinations toward the red, is that this is fake news. And to me, one of the easiest ways to address that kind of attitude is to ask them to explain the excess mortality, which kind of came up a little more strongly out to the public sometime towards late April, early May, and in from different countries. And this is what these graphs show. All the shaded areas in orange show how much excess mortality in different places, different countries has been reported this season compared to the otherwise average mortality going back multiple years. So it is then very clear for a lot of countries that something is going on that is causing a lot more mortality than otherwise the average seasonal for those countries. And this is the graph where I wanted to go back to the situation with Sweden. This is a more recent graph, and the point here is that, as you can see in pink, Sweden mortality has been considerably high. In this case, it is compared to that one of the UK, but without having to go that far, if we stay within that region, if we compare Sweden's mortality rates with their neighbors, Finland and Norway, Sweden's mortality is up to 10 times more than these other neighboring countries. So, and these other countries did establish some level of restrictions, certainly comparable to what other European countries have done, including a complete lockdown for a number of weeks. So the leader epidemiologist of Sweden, in fact, these past few days, this past week, has come out to the public and expressed that, looking back, they probably did not take the best approach to tackle these epidemics in the country, and that they should have probably established some level of restrictions. He's not advocating either for a complete lockdown, but he's very clearly stated that they should have established some level of restrictions, particularly on the side of the public gatherings. Moving on to the US, this is how the map looked back in early May, as far as number of cases by state. And as you can see here, the highly more densely populated areas in northeast of the country is where the most cases were present. Now, we made it to national news right about a week ago, after, I believe it was the New York Times looked at the statistics throughout the country, and they put together this table for places where the number of new cases was increasing faster, and that was the Northwest Arkansas area with the fastest rate of growth for the entire country, in which in just a little over 6 days, the number of cases is doubling. Still, we are experiencing over the past few days some of the highest rates of new cases on a daily basis. So it's not getting any better for Northwest Arkansas, for the state in general, and I think we are in fact still to see the worst part of this disease for our state. Sorry to bring this bad news. These are the latest statistics as of yesterday by county, and as you can see, the Northwest Arkansas area is the darkest one, which means it is one of the worst, or with the highest levels of incidence of disease.
Alberto,
So,
may I ask a question here? This is from Lolly.
Sure.
Is that from the chicken houses?
I don't think there is a statistic that speaks to that, Lolly, but and it might not be necessarily the chicken houses. I think it may have to do a little more with the processing plants.
Exactly. That's really what I meant.
For turkeys and chickens and also not necessarily for Arkansas, but some other states where there is a lot of processing for pigs and cattle, and that's in fact where the most cases have been perhaps recorded. Processing plants for beef cattle and pigs, because unlike processing plants for poultry species that are a little more automated, the pig and cattle processing plants are not as automated as the poultry ones, and so they required a little more labor to process that number of animals. So there's a lot more interaction between workers at these places, and that is one of the factors identified as some of the most riskiest of them all. But I would say you are probably on the right track. Wherever there is a high concentration of people is where we may find higher levels of incidence of the disease. And this is not only for animal industries, it's also been reported in ag in general, for even people working outside picking produce. Somebody else was going to say something.
Yeah, the information we're seeing from the Workers Center for the Center for Workers is that about a third of the cases in Washington County are from the processing plants, and another third is from assisted living centers.
Wow.
Right. Which is another one of the hot spots.
Yep.
And Alberto, it's 20 after now. How much longer do you need?
I'm going through the last slides.
Okay.
So the best defense really is not necessarily for government to tell us to stay home. We need to do a lot on our own to really maintain ourselves as safe as possible, even if we are going to be outside. But certainly trying to avoid public gatherings, and particularly indoors, is one of the best things that we can do. Wearing a mask, a face mask, is also one important thing, and keeping that social distance. That's something highly something And then I'm going to skip through these because this is something that Shelley is going to touch base on, but it is something that was on one of the national news today, with a header saying inequality within inequalities, which alludes to how the minorities, how the poor have been affected the most by this epidemic, or pandemic rather. And the other one that I wanted to just briefly mention is that, as you all might be aware by now as well, is that the CO2 emissions have been reduced by in average 17 to 20%, and yet CO2 levels globally are still peaking today. So emissions have dropped compared to the predictions or the projections, because of all the lowering of activity, but at the same time we are still increasing the total atmospheric CO2 levels, which is not a good thing for us, right? And then again, a lot of things in there, and I think that was the last one.
Alberto, I have one comment, and you might know this, and I don't know if how important it is or not, but the scientist who promoted in Sweden to do what they have done says he's sorry. Right.
Mm-hmm. He's exactly. So he's basically saying, should he had known what he knows today, he would have advocated for something completely different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Alberto? We'll go on to Shelley. Thank you so much, Alberto. Wonderful data.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Alberto. I would just like to thank Alberto before I go on. That's some incredible resources, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to look at the last because we're running out of time.
I just wanted to add that we need to keep that curve on emissions going down. We should regard this whole thing as a unique opportunity as far as global warming is concerned, that the emissions graph is going down now. And if you look at that graph, the whole thing, I think you'll see that it very seldom goes down at all. And it's, I think you said, didn't you, Alberto, 20% down this year is predicted?
17 to 20%, kind of the general numbers, but it is, when you drill down to by country or by sector, it is. I've seen numbers as low as somewhere in single digits, and as high
what it
as
is huge across the whole world. This is huge. 20%
right. So somehow very encouraging. I think
have any decrease, and so we need to take this and run with it and expect the world not to get a 20% decrease every year or anything like that, but to keep it trending downward. We should not, somehow we need to have the attitude that the world should not permit that graph to rise anymore, because you said, as you indicated, anything above zero, that graph is way above zero, anything above zero means we're making things worse and worse and worse because we're adding to the reservoir of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We got to get that down to zero as soon as possible. So we need to keep it trending downward year after year from now on. And the whole global warming community should get behind that general notion that if we have to shut down business or whatever we have to do, bring it down and keep it coming down.
Right. You see, one of the things I did not touch base on is the airline sector, but the airline sector dropped their number of flights by, in some cases, nearly 90%, 80+%. And as we know, that industry is one of the heaviest polluters. And
yes.
Yet, because of all this situation, they were obligated to reduce their number of flights, and again, in some cases, nearly 90%. And that is definitely by far one of the big contributors to all this.
The air industry is one of the worst offenders on all this, and we can get away from a lot of use of air by going online and having meetings like this instead of going to New York or something for some meeting that we could do virtually. We gotta use a lot less air fuel in the future.
We better move on to Shelley's presentation now.
Yeah, we could also ask our governments not to bail out the airline industry by $25 billion.
Yeah, that'd be great.
COVID-19 impacts on vulnerable communities. I just picked and chose a few areas, but I'm beginning with, let me see, wait a minute. There we go, table of contents. I start with talking about Black Americans, people of color in general. Precision for COVID is a website. Thank you for all of those wonderful websites that you had, Alberto. I'll be looking those up, and I want access to your PowerPoint later. There's Equity in Action was a webinar given that was specific information about Arkansas. Native Americans have been especially impacted. Immigration, I covered 2 countries, Honduras. I just 2 slides for Honduras and Guatemala. I did not do Mexico. I'm sorry about that, but just not enough time. Impact on refugees, the impact of U.S. sanctions, and I want to end with something a little uplifting on community values. These were 2 people protesting the George Floyd. So many people have been talking about the connection between not being able to breathe for COVID and not being able to George Floyd, of course, the tragedy of George Floyd. I love this little sign that the boy was carrying, all lives will matter when Black lives matter. The Washington Post analysis about the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on Black Americans. Most of us know this, but there already are higher rates of underlying health conditions, hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, lung disease, less access to care. Hospitals in predominantly Black neighborhoods are more likely to close down than those in predominantly white neighborhoods. And there have been many studies that have shown that there's bias toward white patients over patients of color. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. Black Americans are also impacted because they tend to hold more essential jobs. They're more likely to work in jobs that put workers in close contact with others, such as food service, hotel industry, taxi drivers, and chauffeurs, and insufficient information, bad and inconsistent information from the governments and information that did not seem to represent the Black community. There was also some information my daughter told me about in Philly that was going through the Black community that because there were so few cases in Africa, this rumor started that Black Americans were immune. And she saw in Philly many people not social distancing, just assuming an immunity. I asked Camara from the panel here what was happening with the Black community here, and she said she was fighting that rumor all the time. Somehow that rumor got out, which impacted some people. Also, people's health is already impacted because of housing disparities. Black children are more likely to suffer from asthma already, which makes them higher risk because of they live in older buildings with fecal matter, rodent infestations, and they're living near highways. I saw this movie about a Latino company, a Latino family that lived near a highway, and this whole area, there was an entire school dedicated to kids with asthma. They could not afford to move out of that area, but it was so toxic that like almost every kid in that school had asthma. This is just a picture from put in online by Environmental Health Perspectives on with a report, Dwelling Disparities, How Poor Housing Leads to Poor Health. This is a website, precisionforcovid.org. Yeah.
Shelly, I'm sorry. Could you put your presentation on show mode so that the whole screen is blown up?
How do I do that? Slide.
Usually.
Show slide. Oh man, I don't. View. I don't know how to. Show mode. Play.
Keynote is in the
There we go.
Oh, there it is. Thanks.
Okay, so this is a website that is interactive and you can see what is happening. It's an index. Let me get rid of this. I can't read it myself. Just a minute. Oh, well. This index identifies which communities need the most support as coronavirus takes hold. It's the map to the U.S. Census Tract. The CCVI helps inform COVID planning and mitigation at a granular level. It says 71% of all vulnerable communities are concentrated in the South. The Northeast has been the hardest region hit so far, which Alberto pointed out, yet it contains 1% of the vulnerable communities in the U.S. So they're predicting the worst is yet to come for many of the nation's most vulnerable communities. The darker areas are the more vulnerable communities. It looks like, Of course, we have seen spikes the last few days in Arkansas. Richard is going to be talking about the prison populations. There's a social vulnerability index, the SVI, measures expected negative impacts according to these various indicators. This is on the right. On the left, I put the indicator. On the right, it shows where Arkansas stands. 0.9. 1 is the highest you can be. Arkansas is very high with negative impacts, with socioeconomic status 0.9, household composition and disability, and I can't see that because I don't know how to get rid of this. I can't find my cursor. It's not working. Household composition and disability, minority status and language 0.36, housing type and transportation 0.8, epidemiological factors, Arkansas 0.84, healthcare system factors 0.82, overall Arkansas score 0.96. It's almost a 1. To compare, Alabama is at a 1, Alaska 0.3, Arizona 0.5. You can see that, and New York 0.94. Arkansas is one of the worst for vulnerability for vulnerable communities. This is a website. It was recorded, not a website, it was a webinar. It was recorded. Sharice West spoke about Alice. Rich Huddleston talked about his organization, Arkansas Families for Children and Families. Arkansas, what is it? Anyway, it'll come up. Magali Licoli talked about the Vince Ramos and what they're doing in the chicken plants. In Arkansas, this is Rich Huddleston working with Arkansas Association for Children and Families. That's it. In Arkansas, African Americans are 17% of the population and 36% of the cases. Pacific Islanders have 4.5 higher rates and death rates than the Arkansas average. While more federal aid to states could ease state budget shortfalls, Arkansas lawmakers can help reverse current, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. There's my cursor. I can get rid of this now. No, I can't. Sorry, I don't know how to get rid of that. Let me see. Do you know how to get rid of this so I can see, so I can read my screen?
No.
I'm
Go to the
sorry.
meeting. No.
I don't know how to do it. Sorry, guys. Maybe you can read the screen.
We can't see it. We
You
can't
can't
see anything
see
in the screen. Maybe you could ask.
No. You see that.
Me too.
What do you see? View everyone. Maybe I get rid of.
Yeah,
hide
we
everyone.
can see
We
it.
see the whole screen, Shelley.
You can
I
see the
see it.
whole screen.
We can see the whole screen.
I see it.
Okay.
Right.
Oh, good. Okay, just leave it then. Current trends and create a broader economic recovery by enacting policies that adhere to the 3 principles set out in a new report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It won't. Oh no! Now my. There we go. We need to serve people experiencing homelessness, expand cash assistance under temporary assistance to families, extend health care to people who are undocumented, enhance food assistance for struggling families and individuals. I know that people in the Delta that I've spoken with are struggling to keep the children fed, and they have created their own networks and also connecting with state organizations to keep the children fed while they're missing school. And I imagine they're going to be working with that with the summer. It's been a huge issue. Establish emergency child care services for essential workers. Protect funding for schools and support students most in need. Funding in education is in Arkansas is very challenged because the state budget is very challenged. We're very concerned about continuing support for public education. I even heard a report that tech industries are kind of salivating at the prospect of schools having to be on Zoom because of all the money it would bring into them. Both my daughters have had to teach over Zoom, and they say it's impossible, and there are reports that children are falling behind. We cannot allow that to happen. Release youth from confinement and support reentry into schools and communities. Require and fund COVID-19 data tracking to understand its disparate impacts. Further concerns, many jobs won't be coming back in restaurant and hospitality, childcare. As I said, children from low-income families are losing more ground. A lot of areas in the Delta don't have online access or technology. They already don't have after-school and summer programs or pre-K, and school budgets could face greater cuts than police budgets as cities deal with the economic impact of the pandemic. This is Magali, who has been working with Vince Ramos. She spoke, and she's been in touch with the chicken plant. She says there are risks to meat processing workers, especially respiratory problems. Some are punished by missing work. Most companies are not providing adequate hazard pay. That's up. We don't really know about some of this. Gladys and I are working with an organization that is checking on that. They are still, Magali says they're still suppressing information about how many workers are ill. So far nationally, and this was as of a couple weeks ago, there are 14,000 positive cases in the meat packing plants of COVID-19. Some of the undocumented are afraid to go to the hospital, and Magali emphasizes they want justice, not charity. They have put up, you can see windows, and they're wearing masks, although it's hard for them to wear masks. Tyson has said it's doubled its thank you bonus pool from 60 million to 120 million, and that they said the workers will receive $500 bonuses. We have spoken with some of the workers who said they've received half of that. They've not received all of it. We have heard that they are getting disability payments, and they are allowed to leave work when they're sick. At least 8 Tyson workers have died of COVID-19. This is as of a couple of weeks ago. More than 1,180 have been infected, and Trump signed an executive order on Tuesday compelling meat processing plants to stay open. That was as a couple of weeks ago. Update on poultry workers. There are now more than 100 COVID-19 cases at plants in Northwest Arkansas. This was as of just a few days ago. Ozark Mountain Poultry in Rogers has had 48 cases. Cargill has had 25. Butterball in Huntsville has 8. Benton County has had 69 cases. Washington County, 44 cases. Butterball said it's working hard to flatten the curve. Magali said she'll keep advocating for the employees until the plants do more to stop the spread of COVID-19. I know she did have a petition she was circulating. Alice is asset limited. Can you read that? Was income constrained employed by Sharice West. That's an organization focused on those who they're employed, but they don't have the funds that they need. 41% of Arkansas households can't afford basic household necessities already. The current crisis is demonstrating how exposed Alice households and therefore our communities and businesses are to an emergency. Some of the intersecting ways Alice workers, families, and seniors will be impacted by this crisis. Again, what I said before about impacted workers, they play essential roles in the economies. Many are educating and caring for past, current, and future workforce. Some are in the trenches caring for COVID-19 patients. Yet many Alice workers do not have basic employee protections such as annual salary, adequate health care coverage, and access to other benefits that would help them withstand the COVID-19 crisis. 1/3 of families with children, 38% across the U.S. have an income below the, I can't read that, hopefully you can. The families, they're just saying that families will be severely impacted, and Alice families will forego other supports such as free breakfast, which I talked about, in lunches which have been provided at school. Potential delays in education credentials will add to and prolong student debt, further push out better employment options. Education workers are especially impacted and are more susceptible to serious cases of COVID-19. And as education institutions close, workers will lose wages and struggle to support their own children. Seniors, we know, are the most susceptible. Many seniors have income below the Alice threshold. They already live in close conditions, such as retirement communities. And if these centers close, there will be an additional burden on the families and lack of other supports. My husband is in a facility for several weeks. There were no cases. Now there are 12 cases in the staff, 5 cases in the residents. The cases they found in the staff were all asymptomatic. They didn't know they were carrying it. I'm actually more concerned about the staff at this point than I am about the others. Native Americans are especially impacted. After New York and New Jersey, the place with the highest coronavirus infection rate is the Navajo Nation. It's hard for them to do contact tracing because they live so far apart. Many don't have phones. Many lack clean running water and electricity. And the Indian Health Service per capita spending is much lower than for other state programs like veterans and Medicare. There's an acute nursing shortage and not enough strike teams to get a complete picture of how far COVID-19 is extending into the Navajo Nation. The situation is so alarming that Doctors Without Borders sent at least 2 teams of doctors into the Navajo Nation to help fight the disease. Also, many Diné college students are caring for family members who are sick. And these students already, many of whom already lived in poverty before the pandemic, have lost jobs, face childcare shortages, and are without electricity or running water. Many tribal businesses, this is down to the second paragraph, many tribal businesses have been impacted, especially the casinos. Native Americans are dependent on money from the casinos because they don't have a tax base. The tax base have been literally cut to zero. Tribal governments don't have the money to run the health clinic or child protective services, while state and local governments are also in trouble. At least they have a tax base. So the Native American communities, with the closing of the casinos, are in very dire circumstances. I have read that some casinos are starting to open. Immigration. I've been concerned about Honduras. I've been reading about it recently because I've been reading about the coup in 2009 and how the country became so heavily dictatorial, militarized after that coup. So I was interested in the government's response to the pandemic. It was centralized, militarized, and devoid of oversight. It was doctors and nurses protested lack of protective gear. The government launched a program to provide sacks of food and supplies, but it was criticized for focusing distribution on members of the governing Nationalist Party, and it was insufficient. The government loan program for businesses was unavailable to the informal sector mostly, which comprises 70% of the labor force. As part of the mandatory lockdown, the Honduran government suspended constitutional guarantees, including freedom of expression and assembly. This is something I've been extremely concerned about with other countries. I believe, what was it, Hungary, that became increasingly authoritarian. Honduras Human Rights Roundtable summarized the concerns about the government's handling of the pandemic, denouncing the reduction of civic space and the repression of the work of human rights defenders, the unnecessary and disproportionate use of force, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, setbacks to workers' rights, such as dismissals and unjustified suspension of labor contracts, and the politicized distribution of humanitarian aid. We know that already before this, this is where Berta Cáceres was from, fighting for workers' rights and the prevention of a dam. She was murdered. There have been many assassinations of activists in Honduras. In Guatemala, already suffering a huge amount of poverty. I was down there and have seen part of the situation. As the number of confirmed cases passed 700, many people took to the streets of Guatemala cities in recent days, waving white or red flags, signaling they need food and medicine. Many Guatemalans have lost their jobs or can't access informal work due to strict lockdown measures, and a quarter of overseas remittances, approximately 12% of the country's GDP, have stopped. It's a picture of Guatemala. I'm particularly touched by Guatemala. I stayed in an orphanage run by a sister Sordina, a nun, and some other nuns, and they have they are under lockdown. The only person who can leave that orphanage is Sordina, but still they have mandated to take people in. Guatemala has weak development, high levels of violence, and it's forcing mass immigration. Of course, climate change is also forcing mass immigration. They're facing, of course, tough U.S. anti-immigration policies. But Guatemala is bound by a 2019 accord that obliges it to not only accept Guatemalan deportees from the United States, but also any failed asylum seekers the United States wants to return from El Salvador and Honduras. Last month, as COVID-19 cases rose rapidly, Guatemalan President Alejandro Giammattei suspended deportations after planes were found to be carrying large numbers of infected people. The U.S. authorities now appear to be testing deportees prior to departure. Some 20% of infections in Guatemala have been traced to the returnees. Expanding out into the world, water scarcity in the world adds to fears. In Zimbabwe, which is already suffering crippling sanctions, some 3 billion people live in indigenous communities. Oh, and some, I can't read that, I'm sorry, you guys read it. Indigenous communities in Brazil to war-savaged villages in northern Yemen have nowhere to wash hands with soap and clean water, according to the charity group WaterAid. The group fears that global funding is being rushed toward vaccines and treatments without any real commitment to prevention. And other diseases are also being left uncared for, because, like malaria and I suppose tsetse disease too. The diseases that they have already been suffering because of dealing with COVID-19. In the Arab region alone, about 74 million people don't have access to a basic hand washing facility. This is a tent in Moria, this in Greece, refugee area in Greece. How are refugees affected? Refugee camps in which 1 out of every 3 refugees lives are often located in remote areas with limited health care. Usually there aren't any hospitals in refugee camps. Some of the bigger camps do have them, but few of them will have ICUs or ventilators. And also, there's a pressing question of whether refugees will be able to access host country hospitals and ICUs, when in many cases there aren't enough for that country's national population. Access to health care is a major vulnerability. Refugee populations are more vulnerable. They often live similar to the families in the United States, multiple families in high population density conditions. People are especially concerned about the Rohingya population in Bangladesh, which I'm sure Cindy can tell us about. There are almost 900,000 people in an increasingly dense area. They're also more likely to have underlying health conditions, such as acute malnutrition. There are also over 40 million people who've left their home in fear of persecution and conflict, but remain in their country. So internally displaced persons, such as those in Darfur, Sudan, as well as Idlib, Syria, they're at extreme risk because they're being persecuted in their own country and sometimes don't even have the same rights that refugees have. The healthcare system in these places is already in shambles. There's a refugee camp in Bangladesh. There have already been COVID-19 outbreaks within these populations. They're trying to do what they can with it. I'm going to go skip this because I want to get to what Richard says. There are key strategies to prevent and mitigate cases among refugee populations, which they're trying to use. Again, water and COVID-19. Water is a huge issue. In Africa, 1.3 billion people must leave their homes to get water. In the Amazon, I'll show you a picture. The mandatory lockdown and its enforcement in the cities has left the region more vulnerable to illegal extractivist industries. There was some concern about some missionaries who wanted to get to these tribes which were isolated. I don't know if they were able to stop or not, but you can see that the people are dealing with people coming in trying to steal the resources, the wood, and probably drilling for oil. U.S. sanctions. I won't do this. I won't go over this too much, but there's a website, sanctionskill.org. It's a webinar, and it talks about the effect of U.S. sanctions with COVID-19. Many compared the officer's knee on George Floyd's neck with the sanctions, which are causing the deaths of thousands of innocents. Sanctions are, they affect a third of the population with more than, they impact 39 countries. These are the countries facing economic sanctions. I really encourage you to listen to some of this webinar series. They prevent countries providing the needed medical equipment, nutrition, and materials. They affect the ability of economic sectors to perform trades in energy, banking, health, industry, and transportation sectors. They devalue the currency, causing inflation. North Korea has been severely impacted by sanctions. Cuba has been severely impacted. They were unable to receive a plane of medical supplies because of sanctions. Venezuela, they were able to get some supplies from Iran. This is actually a positive. This was a woman, Lashana Williams. Actually, when she saw that people in her area in Seattle were going hungry, she set up a tent and tables and hot plates and got donations and set up community breakfasts. They began communal grocery shopping where there are a few fresh food markets. She says there's a whole different set of values when you know people have your back, William says. When you're in communities that aren't of financial means, the means to support from within are different and enormous. The way you view what is important is through a different set of lenses. About 4,000 people, very diverse population. I'll just end with the end. Williams says she believes not just South Park, but the nation will emerge stronger because of what we're enduring now. There's a reason that catastrophes hit, and there's fallout from that, she says. And if the fallout happens to offer ways that we as humans can change, we will most certainly be better off. Okay, Richard. Let me see how I turn this off. Oh no, I can't find my cursor. I can't find my cursor to turn it off. Do you know how, can you get it off?
Well, I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will talk and you can.
Okay, figure out how to get it.
There you go.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any difference.
Don't
talk.
So anyway, I'm talking, reading off some notes that I did for a radio story that played on KPSQ last month, and by the middle of May, a third of the Arkansas cases for positive COVID testing were in the prison system, which contains less than 1% of the population, which means that you're more than 30 times as likely to become infected if you're in prison. This began in April 10th. There was an inmate who was sick enough that he got sent to the hospital out of Cummins prison, and so that was a Friday. By Monday, they had tested the rest of the inmates in the barracks, and 43 out of the 46 in his barracks tested positive. So they thought, okay, well, we've got this under control. We'll just separate the couple of negatives out.
It's under control.
But and then they were testing some people that they felt had been in contact with them, which actually was most of the prison, but the people who were deciding how to do it, I don't think had ever visited a prison, much less Cummins. And so they went through the week, and by Friday they had tested 300 inmates in Cummins and had come up with 129 positive cases. They kind of realized that things were a little more widespread than they thought. So over that next weekend, they tested a total of 1,000 at Cummins, and they had 142. Let's see, 117 more were in Cummins. At that point, they had tested the main building at Cummins, and so that a couple of days later, they ended up tallying their totals and had 600 inmates out of 1850 that had tested positive, and they thought, okay, now we have it under control. But there were inmates in some other barracks outside the main unit, and it took another 3 weeks. They were kind of, if somebody came down with severe symptoms, they would test that barracks, and so they were doing it piecemeal. It took them 3 weeks to test all the inmates at Cummins, at which point they had 900 positives and 60 staff member testing positive. So kind of by the middle of May, they thought things were kind of under control, and then on, I think it was May 12th, they had an outbreak in Randall Williams unit in Pine Bluff, and it was pretty similar. They had somebody who was really sick. They tested the rest of the barracks, and then said, okay, well, we're not going to make the same mistake. We'll test the rest of the building, and thought that they had it under control. But then they realized that there were other buildings in the unit, and they tested the rest of them. By the end of the week, they had like 300 people in Randall Williams out of 550 that had tested positive. Since the middle of May, there have been a major outbreak in the federal prison in Forest City, and the last I heard, there were 331, which is a couple weeks old. But that's, and I don't have numbers on how many total are part of the prison in Forest City, but they seem to have a much wider spread out into the community in Forest City than they did related to the other state prisons. So in the last couple of weeks, there's been reports of 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 inmates testing positive on a particular day. I really haven't been able to find information about where they are. And I suspect that they are waiting for somebody sick enough to go to the hospital before they test the rest of the barracks. And so there's probably another outbreak that's brewing that hasn't bubbled up to overflow the pot. But it's really when you're an inmate, you don't have the choice of social isolating or having access to masks, except what they happen to give you. They did start making masks in the prisons that were had sewing facilities for inmates, and so I think at this point most of them have access to masks, but still I've heard that there's a lot of guards that don't wear masks in the prisons, and the options for isolation has been really limited. I guess by the middle of May, ASA had released 300 inmates at a variety of prisons, none from Cummins, to provide some space. These were inmates who were within 6 months of the release date and were in for nonviolent offenses, to provide space so that if they had an outbreak, they would have room to do some isolation, which they really didn't have in Cummins. I suspect that most of the 900 that tested negative in Cummins either were tested too early and got infected later, and they said, well, we tested you last week, so we're not going to test you this week unless you've got severe symptoms. Either that, or they tested them late and they'd already recovered from the disease before they got around and testing them. I really think that if they did antibody testing, that they would find that there's probably at least 1,700 out of the 1,800 in Cummins that have been exposed and have had the disease. Luckily, the severe symptoms has been fairly limited. There have been 7 deaths out of the inmates in Cummins. There was another inmate death that was reported. I think it was at the Randall Williams, but I'm not sure about that. And that was at a time when there was 100 deaths in the state. So it was 8% of the population with that had died, with less than 1% of the population in the prison system, and almost all of that in just a couple of units. So that's kind of a brief overview. I can send to Gladys how to find the radio report that I did for KPSQ. It's not a specific web link, but it's at kpsq.org, and there's archives. And if you were to look for the David Pakman archives for May 19th or 21, I'll put this in a note that she can send out. It's something that comes at the beginning of David's show, starts a minute or two after the show starts. So anyway, that's basically what I had to say. It's just people that are under the care of the state that haven't been taken care of. If there's any questions, could open that up for me or for anybody else.
I got a comment.
Yeah.
Just another example of the harmfulness of over incarceration in America, and probably especially in Arkansas. And a question: is the prison population a more or less typical population physically? They are pressed close together, so they're atypical in that sense. I wonder, for instance, are they older or younger than the average, or are they pretty average age distribution?
They're quite a bit younger. There are definitely some older inmates. I would say the average age is probably late 20s, early 30s. Most of the inmates being in their 20s or 30s. There are a few that are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. One of the inmates that I do know about in particular at Cummins went to the infirmary. He was really sick. The infirmary gave him a Tylenol and sent him back to the barracks, and he died that night. He was 29 years old.
The youth of the inmates on the average is kind of surprising, because they seem to have COVID at a high rate. And of course, that's because they're pressed together, but young people don't get it so easily.
Well, the thing is, they get it, they just don't have the severe symptoms. And they get it as easily as anybody else. And when you're living in a unit that has 50 beds in a 20 by 24 foot room, and everybody's got a bed 2.5 feet away from yours, you know, it's a closed in space, and it spreads.
So they're getting a high number of cases that are tested positive, but that don't show symptoms.
Yeah, the one time that the Secretary of Health, Nate Smith, talked about it was that at that point, they less than 50% had symptoms. That the majority were symptomless positive cases.
That's an indication for the general population then. We probably have twice as many cases out there.
Richard, I think there's already been some preliminary reports or anecdotal observations from different places, going from, say, New York, and a little more recently also from Sweden, that I've seen, and they all point at very much higher levels of indications that a high percentage of the population may have been exposed. In New York, they were speculating figures into the 20-some% of the population that potentially has been already exposed to this virus by doing some small, that's one caveat, test to look for antibodies. And swing all the way over to the Sweden situation, as you recall, a country that decided not to do much with regards to restrictions and social distancing and all that. They are looking at numbers somewhere around 27, 28%, something like that, of the population that might have been already exposed. And Richard is absolutely right. Most of the individuals that are exposed tend to not show cases, or at least very mild, that may not require to go to a clinic even to get where he or she would be tested. So some speculative numbers may point up to 80% or so of those individuals that get exposed to this virus may not ever get tested, because they either don't show any symptoms or their symptoms are very mild.
One of the things, when I was working on this story, I called in as a reporter for KPSQ and asked Nate Smith, the Secretary of Health, if they were planning on doing antibody testing in Cummins to find out who actually, out of the total population, since most of them had only been tested once for active cases, and he said that they really didn't have plans to do that sort of testing. And one of the issues with that is the antibody testing are not nearly as accurate as the active case testing. The active case testing is better than 99% accurate, both in eliminating false positives and false negatives, where the antibody tests, most of them are around 95%. And so it doesn't really tell you a whole lot about a particular individual, about whether or not you actually have been have had COVID sometime earlier and you've recovered, because of the high, 5% false positive and negatives is a pretty big margin of error for something like this. But if they were to test the whole unit at Cummings, they would be able to say, all right, if the 900 that tested negative the first time through, if 90% of them showed antibodies, they would say, yeah, we can't tell for sure who is the ones that actually have the case, but we would know that most of them had, and they weren't interested in testing to find out.
One of the questions I have, or I wonder about the prison system, is really about the measures that the authorities may have into place as a plan or program to avoid tracking this virus inside the premises in the first place, because the virus does not just blow into the premises. Somebody tracks it in. It's most likely an asymptomatic staff member that comes into work one day and starts spreading it inside. And once it is inside, it is a wildfire.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's, the fact that there is a significant number, even among older individuals, who don't show symptoms, that they did eliminate visitors of all sorts coming into the prison. You have to be paid staff in order to get in, since I think it was late March, they kind of shut things down, but that didn't keep guards that had been exposed from coming in and bringing it into the prison. And so once it gets in, it's everywhere. And so yeah, I really expect there to be outbreaks in most of the other systems, because the guards come and go every day.
I think that you're a bit optimistic on 99% accuracy on the testing, because some of the medical people have reported as much as 30% false negatives on some of the tests. Now, I'm sure they're working to improve the testing, but 30% false negatives is really, really bad.
Yeah, well, part of that, okay, part of that is if you're testing somebody during the proper period. In the first 48 hours after you exposed, if it's developing in your body, you're going to test negative. They know that for sure. It takes at least 48 hours, sometimes as much as 72 hours for the test to show up as being positive on the active cases. So there is that at the beginning, that you can be pre-symptomatic, that that you get tested and it looks like you're a negative and you don't. So there is, it's a timing issue as well, and that complicates it somewhat.
These are people who are testing negative and are exhibiting symptoms.
Well, yeah, I think if the tests are done properly, that it's much higher than that.
I don't think, I can't think of any medical test that has 99% reliability.
Well, I think, Malcolm, there are some tests that are showing that level of precision, but it is one thing that we see, for example, with this COVID-19 situation, is there is not a single kit out there. There is more than one, and if you look at the statistics or reports from other countries, pretty much every country may have at least one that they developed on their own, at least countries with significant infrastructure. And one of the things that we do have with this is precisely we don't know a lot about this disease, so we don't know what is the right window to test individuals. And as Richard was saying, or even you were alluding to, even if it is just a 5% false negative rate, we may have an individual in the very initial stages of infection, and that individual tests negative, and then that individual is on the clear for days or weeks before he or she may show any symptoms. And in the meantime, there is a spread around, and so it is not a clear cut on testing even, but I think the technology is there, and we still have to rely on it. Now, most of these testing is based on the detection of the antigen or the virus, but I think the antibody testing is also telling us a good piece of the whole picture. In other words, it will tell, as Richard was saying, which individuals have been exposed to that. It just gives an additional piece of information that allows a better appreciation of the whole picture.
Well, the United States has been behind the rest of the world in testing, from the get-go, because we tried to develop our own test instead of using tests that were developed by the World Health Organization, and it was a disaster. And it's still a disaster. And the antibody tests are even less reliable than the tests for active infection. There are, medical tests have two rates, false negative and false positive. And there is no medical test that does not have those two things. So, but our testing has had a very high rate of false negatives, and they know that. Now, tests are getting better, probably because we've got 50 different laboratories who are developing tests instead of one centralized laboratory who's doing a good job of developing and then an exhaustive testing. We've got 50 laboratories who are developing tests and putting them out there without exhaustive testing to make sure that they're reliable. So the United States has followed a very, very different path from the rest of the world as
Malcolm,
far
I
as
think
testing,
it's
and it
just
has not done us any favors.
Malcolm, I think it's just another example of the fact that we ought not to be posing as the leader of the free world as we generally do.
I intend to write
medical
I
problems.
intend to write a couple of op-eds on exceptional America, highlighting ways in which we are really exceptional and ought to be ashamed of it.
Go to it. You can probably get them published in the Northwest Arkansas Times or the Northwest Arkansas Democrat Gazette.
Yeah.
We need to hear that. We're way overextended around the
Well,
world.
the people who need to hear it are the MAGA hats, and they won't be listening.
Any more comments, anybody?
About time for me to sign off here.
I'm so glad this many we could practice on this many. That's wonderful. We had, what is it, 3, 4? Hey, Edward, I see you're here as a latecomer. We're glad you came in too.
I don't see him though.
Yeah, no, he's keeping himself in the dark from
He
us.
doesn't have his camera on.
Yeah.
Hi, Ed.
Edward, you want to turn on your mic and turn on your camera for a minute?
Could we hear from Cindy for just a minute on what happened, what involved at all with the work on COVID-19 in Bangladesh and what she's seeing?
We returned to America in June, the end of June of 2019. And then we were traveling in America. But I've been in touch with the people at the hospital where I worked, and they gave the hospital in Rajshahi, it's in the northwest part of the country. So the Rohingyas are in the southeast, Rajshahi is in the northwest. But they gave the hospital over to the government to use as a COVID isolation hospital. So that hospital now is no longer seeing normal patients, no maternity care, anything, only COVID patients. And they're, the government hospital, there's a large government hospital about a mile away. They're keeping some of the patients, they're sending patients over, they're being tested, and they're getting some. It's growing. It's gonna really take off before long because they haven't been testing. They just don't have the tests, and they don't. I mean, sterile technique is pretty low in general in Bangladesh, and so the whole idea of isolation. I spoke with my friend yesterday, who works in that hospital, and she said just on Monday they opened up transportation again for the first time after Eid. They've been closed for I think about a month and a half. And they're telling people, okay, skip a seat on the buses, only every other seat. That is so not Bengali. They crowd everywhere. So, and there's just argument to people that haven't, the people that own the buses, they want to make all the money they can because they've lost all this revenue. So it's going to really take off. So it's just going to be a little behind the curve. At first, they were blaming all the foreigners, everyone out coming in, and they were trying to isolate them. But now it's definitely in, and so it's just going to be a matter of time. Thank you. Yeah.
Gladys, it went pretty well.
Yeah,
with so
I think so
many people.
too. Yeah,
Yes, it did.
a lot of good stuff came out, and I'm thinking it'd probably be good if we wrap up and shut off the recording. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. I think we've got most of the juice, and